Here we are again. We've just finished, Tim, going through 12 principles in the PMBOK. And I guess we start our domains today, huh?
Yes, yes, I'm excited about this. When we went from the sixth edition to the seventh edition, we got rid of the processes and inputs and outputs, but we retained the attitude and the mindset of the principles. But on top of that, we have domains. What do you think about domains, and what do you feel about them?
So let me go back to what you just said. We didn't really get rid of process, right? We put it in PMBOK terms, we put it into sort of auxiliary type formats, right? Into other documents.
Right, exactly. We moved it to the process group practice guide.
Yeah. So I guess the best way that I can describe this in my mind is that when we went from PMBOK 6, the body of knowledge version 6, to PMBOK 7, we really did shift from knowledge areas to domains. And what you're asking is, what's my kind of definition or how I understand domains?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So I would put it this way, that it's, in the old days, we would focus on process and deliverables, process and deliverables, process and deliverables, right?
Mhm.
Arts and charts, schedules and walls. But now in domains, we kind of look at the outcomes from all of that.
Right.
And then the measurements to validate those outcomes are actually happening. And I think this is where people confuse, and maybe you can help us kind of understand the confusion, because we've just gone through the 12 principles. We're going to talk about the 8 domains, but there's a little bit of, I would say, overlap between the two concepts.
Sort of, sort of. Let me actually tell you a story, and I think it'll help us with this conversation.
Yeah.
So, once upon a time, my supervisor said, "Okay, Tim, you're going to be the project manager, and here's how you manage projects. Here's what scope is, here's what schedule is, here's what budget is, and quality and risk." Great. I got that underhand. He said, "How are your stakeholders doing? How are your team doing?" I said, "Well, my budget's doing well and my schedule's doing." He said, "No, no. Yet, see, this is the thing, Tim. These are things that we use to measure progress and find out if we're having problems. Another facet of project management is dealing with these areas that you need to pay attention to." He said, "You got to pay attention to your stakeholders. You got to pay attention to your team too, don't you? And you got to have to pay attention to risk and quality." So, risk and quality are tools and they're mechanisms on how we figure project health, but they're also focus areas. And that's where we get the principles. Domains is where we express our principles. So you can see these principles as like arrows, and the domains are all 8 targets where you focus your principles. And that's the best image that I can come up with.
So what you just recounted was something along my experience. And I fear it's the experience of many up and coming project managers when they take on their first team lead position or their first project management position. And that is, they concentrate on the process and the deliverables. And what you just talked about was what your supervisor told you was, yes, you need to concentrate on that, but no, that's not everything that's so important. You also have to deal with the principles of project management, which you've been talking about. And I think that's the behavioral aspects of people, right? In
Right.
terms of how our teams and how our clients or our customers behave on the project itself. And then, as you were saying, the domains would be the outcomes from that, from both process and paying attention to the people, the behaviors.
Exactly. Let's take the first domain that we were going to address this week, which is stakeholders. Again, we look at the principles, we know how we're supposed to approach these stakeholders, but stakeholders are only one target where we express things like leadership and complexity and that kind of thing. That's exactly right. And stakeholders are just one area that we get to manage and lead.
So, in terms of defining stakeholders, I've always looked at them. Well, first of all, let me interrupt myself. First of all, typically we think of stakeholders as being those that we are building the system for, on whose behalf we are managing the project. But we could say that stakeholders also include those people on our own teams and within our own executives.
Yeah, I like to defer back to the formal definition.
Which is?
They can influence the project, and they can be influenced by the project. And if either one of those is true, I'm going to have to pay attention to these people. Or number one, they're not going to be happy. Or number two, they're going to do things that could make my project rocky or even fail.
And you will have stakeholders who object to the objectives of your project. I've been on those projects where you've got the cheerleaders on the one side who are, rolling up their sleeves to help you, and you've got the naysayers on the other side saying, this will never work. You're going to put our people out of work. You're going to cause problems within our IT shop. And they've got all kinds of negative reasons as to why this project should not go on. And I think what you're saying, and when we talk about stakeholders, is it's the whole management of that domain of stakeholders that helps us become better project managers.
Oh, yeah. I think we can understand the term stakeholder, but the concept boggles the mind. And this is some of the pushback I get with my students. It's like, how do I figure out how many stakeholders to identify? It's like that unknown. How do you predict unplannable risk? You just do it. You don't worry about, does it have an end? You just say, it's like brushing your teeth or getting a good night's rest. It's just part of the habits of an ongoing project management experience.
Well, when I was preparing for today's podcast, I actually went back into the Project Management Body of Knowledge version 7 to get an understanding of how PMI defines what is a stakeholder from the domain perspective. And it's interesting, and I actually agree with 2 of the 3 definitions.
Oh, good.
So the first one is you want a productive working relationship with your stakeholders. And I say amen to that, because the more productive that working relationship is, the better the result, the better the entire atmosphere of the project. Skipping to bullet number 3 in their definition is that the stakeholders who are the beneficiaries of what you're doing on the project and building the system, they're going to be supportive, and they're going to be satisfied, and they're going to really benefit you. And yet, if you do have that opposition, it's not going to stall the project. So I agree with that as well from a stakeholder perspective. But interestingly, their middle bullet, their middle part of their definition says that stakeholders agree with project objectives. And that's the only one I took a little bit of a objection to. And that is because I think it's the stakeholders who set the project objectives, and me as the project manager needs to agree with them.
And let's go even further. I don't think agreement is necessary.
That's true.
I think consensus is necessary.
Yeah.
And we've had that discussion here on the show, haven't we?
We have. Now, by the way, that's not to say that as a project manager who understands IT and who is gaining an understanding of the client on whose behalf I'm building the system, that's not to say that I'm not going to try to influence their objectives in terms of how they set them. And it's not from a self-serving point of view, it's from a serving of them point of view. But I want them to firmly establish their objectives, and then I will agree with them so that we can work together in getting the outcome we need.
Yeah. It's that shared accountability that actually you bring. And again, this is the art of project management, not just the science of being able to engage with people, after you've identified them, and assess them and be able to get the information you need to be able to determine all of this information, how you're going to treat them, what they need, what their purpose is on the project, and so forth.
Well, and you said something interesting too when you started this conversation, this part of the conversation, and that is that you have groups or entities who are influencing, but they're also groups or or entities who are being influenced.
Right,
Which
right.
do you think is the more important in that equation?
Yes. So here's the thing. I believe in a user-centered design model, which means I am first and foremost looking at the people who are going to have to live with the results of the project, the direct people who are going to have to live with it, not the executives who are going to oversee the work and understand and extract the strategic value, but the people who are going to have to be able to put the deliverable through its paces, be able to fix it, be able to determine when it needs to be upgraded. And I've heard you just a few minutes ago say the same thing. Is that right?
That it is right. And you know what, in my early years as a brand new project manager who wanted to show my stuff, I thought it was up to me to influence the client so that I could selfishly return more profit to my firm. And what in fact I learned as I matured and as I had some stumbles along the way because they can see through that. Stakeholders can see through that. But when I learned that, I think it's more important to be influenced by the stakeholder. In other words, have their objectives take precedence. From that perspective, my projects went much more smoothly. And interestingly enough, the profit margins did not suffer.
Yeah, and it's simple. There are simple actions we can take. For instance, ask more questions than give directions. Don't hold back your judgment until you find the story and the context. These little things that people are saying, this is what you really need to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And you'll hear project managers talk about this all the time. That what they're saying is just what you said, which is withhold judgment, let them speak, because it's their voice. And the reason you even have a job is because they have that need.
Well, and I'll tell you something else from a consulting perspective, because all of my projects were for profit. It's not only just this project, but it's the next one. Because if I didn't get a good reference from this project, I didn't get the next one.
Right.
It had repercussions going forward.
This is the opportunity I have right now. By the way, I'm a working project manager. I'm not just a teacher and an instructor. I'm a working project manager too. And I'm always evaluating projects that are interesting and provide me growth. And the thing is, I'm always being brought in. We just have 6 weeks of work that need to be done. But
yeah,
depending on how well that goes, let's see, because if you're a good fit, wouldn't it be great to give you a big ride for the next 2 years? If that's nice, why not the next 7 years? And this is what you learn. Why my mentor said this, and think about it from understanding your stakeholders, okay? There is no small project. I had to learn that the hard way.
yeah.
And it's the stakeholders that tell you whether the project is big or small. It's not the complexity, it's not the length, it's not the budget of a project, it's how important it is.
Well, I remember distinctly probably about 3/4 of the way through my career, I was brought on by an agency to help them write a request for proposal for a system that they wanted to implement that was being mandated by their sponsors, and just to come in and use my ability to write and to be a technical writer, basically. Well, it was a 1-year project. That was my contract. What was interesting, much along the lines of what you were just recounting, what was interesting was that in writing that request for proposal, they saw that I knew as much about their business as they did, and I knew the vendor community very well in terms of who might be bidding on this opportunity. And so they asked me to stay on a couple more years to help them with vendor selection, and to then also do oversight of some of the early parts of the system or early parts of the project. Well, what was interesting is when that contract completed, we were partway through, and they said, no, we want you to stay around. You understand the vendors, you understand our people, and you understand what we need to be done. We need you to stay around. But that was a long way. That 1 year became 6. And it was truly as a result of thinking from my stakeholders' perspective the whole time.
We make it sound so simple. I said something earlier, right? I said, ask questions. Just ask questions. Don't give direction. Just ask questions and get that knowledge that helps you understand what they want, not what you want. Now, this part of project management, this stakeholder and behavioral part, is this tricky or is it that simple?
No, it's tricky. It's tricky. By the way, you're very astute in what you said in terms of asking questions, because not only are you asking questions from the perspective of you learning, but you're asking questions in such a way that when the client or customer answers them for themselves, they set their own direction as a result of their own answer. It's the way you ask the question. And so when you said tricky is kind of a way of saying you can have finesse.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the part that makes this so exciting. And again, I hearken back to what I said earlier. When I was a green project manager, man, oh man, I just wanted to impress my boss with how I could run a schedule and how I can maintain budget. But somehow that's the rules and tools, or the arts and charts, as we like to call them here. What is really exciting about managing a project, and I think you can almost hear it in my voice, is that finesse of working with people, especially your stakeholders.
You see this in other areas of business too. You see this with sales reps. They do the same thing. I worked with sales closely for 7.5 years inside of a multinational corporation. And they're the same way. When you get a new sales rep, they're fast. They have all the information. They need to get it out quickly so that they can close that deal quickly. Where you have somebody who's been a decade or two in sales, they're sitting back. It's like you said, it's all finesse. It's all nuance.
I don't know if you've heard that ad that runs on the radio every once in a while. 98% of sales people have never read a book on sales. And then they go into this whole thing, this whole shtick about how people need to read their books. I don't know if you've heard that ad, but if I read 1 or 2 books on sales and 20 books on human behavior, I'd be a better salesperson.
Yes. And that's the nature of project management. Our work is not managing the project work. It's creating an environment so the work is easily done. But before you do that, it's managing environment such that people feel comfortable and relaxed enough to express what they need.
Well, and we talked about this in past podcasts on and off, but this is where the soft skills come in. The hard skills, meaning the technical skills, the process skills, those can come from learning and experience. But the soft skills, and I was just reading an article from, I think it was Harvard Business or one of those, of what organizations are looking for in their managers right now in terms of their soft skills. And that's the place that we should be developing our skills. Yes, process and technologies is so important, but much more important to the project manager is those soft skills, that ability to work with the behavior of your team and your clients' teams.
Let's actually pull back even further.
Okay.
You see this trend in a lot of business and economics and cultural literature, right? People who study our society and our civilizations. Back about 1930, 1940, the trend was talking about the end of post-industrialization and the beginning of the information age. And first you have people like, what is his name? I have his book up here. I forget. But you have W.E. Deming and you have Peter Drucker coming up in this. They'd gone to school in the 30s, and they were coming up in the 60s and 70s as the silver-haired experts, right? And they were saying 21st century is the age of the information worker, which means knowledge management, which means we have to understand people more than we have to understand the technology. Yes, there will be technology workers, but the primary work of business and of society is going to be knowledge itself. And this is not just a trend in project management. This is a whole cultural shift that we're going through. So you're hitting the nail right on the head, and it's a more general statement than we even realize.
Those guys were so smart.
Yeah,
but don't you think it's true? There was a book that was popular a few years ago. It's like Everything I Learned in Kindergarten or something like that.
Yes.
Something like, but isn't the whole idea is that if we learn to read people and get along with people and understand people and behave with people as the way they want to be behaved with, isn't that kind of the key to anything?
Well, let me give you a little story, okay?
Yeah.
My dad was the oldest of his generation in our community, right? Basically, I had a great grandparents who moved into southern Idaho, into Boise Valley, and then they had 7 children. And then those 7 children had a bunch of children. And of those, my dad was the oldest. And he worked a lot with his uncles, right? About 5 of them were males. And he said, Tim, look the way you're using your saw. You're using 3 inches of your saw, right? You're going back, forth, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. What would happen if you used the whole length of the saw? And he said, my uncles actually taught me this. And they said there are easy ways to get work done with tools and hard ways to get work done with tools. You got to understand the tool. And as a project manager, what are our primary tools? It's the interaction with people. So if we understand the warp and weave of human behavior, it's only natural that we'll be working with it and taking advantage of it instead of working against it.
Yeah. Or instead of taking those shortcuts along.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Like that. Hey, I want to go back to something you said that your students asked you, how do I know when there's enough stakeholders or something along that?
Yeah.
I don't understand that question.
Well, the question generally is, do I have to continue to identify stakeholders? Why can't I identify all the stakeholders just at the beginning and say, I'm done? And then the lead on question to that is, how do I know I'm done?
Oh, okay.
There's a problem. There's a problem with that, isn't there?
Yeah, because there's no limit and there's no set number. And part of it is, yes, who are we doing this for? Whose benefit are we doing this? Therefore, who has a stake in the game? But I think there's another aspect to that, and that is along the lines of their interest as well, whether or not, or their awareness of the project. So it's not so much that we have enough, it's that do we have the right stakeholders and have we attended to all of them?
Say, that's the trick. And that's what I was thinking about. You know, early in the project, it's your key stakeholders, the ones who have the greatest influence of the work. And then as you progress into planning, it's the planning stakeholders, the ones who have the most influence on the planning. And then the people who are doing the work, you know, the team members and the experts and the people supporting your team from you know, the people who are going to receive it. They're the ones. So you're always focusing, but your stakeholders may come and go, and your understanding of the stakeholders are going to come and go too.
Well, exactly. And you need to learn about your stakeholders. You need to get to know them in terms of certainly their influence in the project, their interest in the project. and how the project is going to benefit them, or the result. And I know very specifically, I remember one system we were working on where we were probably a third of the way through the project when suddenly we got a call from the head of the employee union. No one had ever considered the union itself as being a stakeholder. In this particular situation, the concern that came from the union was, will this new automation put a bunch of our people out of work?
Oh, yeah.
So they may not have had any influence on the, requirements and the design and the development and the testing of the system, but they certainly were stakeholders in terms of having an interest in the results of what came from that system.
See, this is the tricky part of identifying stakeholders right here. Actually, the full definition of stakeholders are the people, groups, or entities that may influence the project, be influenced, and also may perceive to be influenced by the project. I was working on a data center project, and we were doing some automation work up there. And IT, as a group, came to the project and said, your job is going to put a third of us out of work. We had to get the CIO involved in that. Yeah. We could address it from a consulting standpoint and say no, but we needed somebody who had executive vision and executive influence that could actually say, no, what we're doing is freeing you up here so you can work on this more important work over here. If they think it impacts them, they could have negative influence on your project. And we need to identify those two.
We do, yes, because opposition it can be an underlying factor that we're not even aware of. If we're not aware of it, it can stall us out. It can cause repercussions down the line.
Yeah, it can be passive aggressive too. Yeah. It can be just, okay, we're just not going to use it.
By the way, for our listeners who may be curious as to the result of uncovering that union as a stakeholder, we were able to show the union that not a single person would be laid off or lose their jobs because of the system, because the automation took care of what we would call the scut work of their union members and allow them to truly do the work for which they were hired. So think of a calculator. Before we had calculators, we did everything by pencil, and we had our arithmetic formulas. When we had calculators, we took that part out of the equation. It became much simpler, and then we could pay attention to what it was, why we were doing the calculation. So it was very similar to what we did with that union.
Exactly. And this actually gets into a really interesting topic. How do I move a negative stakeholder to a positive stakeholder? Let me give you an idea here, okay? So people are people. I'm going to work really well where I feel I have personal meaning. I'm relevant, right? That basically I'm recognized. Like you said, the union workers are recognized. And if the project actually makes me irrelevant, boom, there's something in everybody's head that says no. And we have to recognize this. And the funny thing is, this little switch, this binary switch between I am meaningful to I have no meaning, may have to do with the technology change in a project, may have to do with the perception of the person as a worker in their work environment. It may even be the perception of that person of the importance of their organization to the corporation. And this is something that every manager and leader needs to look at. And again, you can tell people just get to work and do the work. But what does that do? Does that get them in a position to help your project or help your work become more successful?
Yeah, exactly. And I've had situations where we've had a fairly negative person that we've, just by conversation and just by listening to their concerns and by answering questions, we were able to turn them from opposition perhaps to full-blown engaged in the project. But I will tell you that I've had situations also, I can think of at least two, where we literally had to cut the person, that they were such a negative influence and were not going to be turned to the positive side, that we literally had to work with their own management to remove them from the project. And that's a sad day, but sometimes, for the benefit of millions of dollars being spent on the budget, the long-term effect on the receiving public who are the beneficiaries of your system, at some point you just have to cut bait. So
that's right. It's funny because, like I said, relevance has different meanings for different individuals and groups.
Yeah.
And relevance can be just, I recognize you. I sit down and have a cup of coffee with you in the cafeteria once a week, right? That may be all it needs. But you are also right in saying there are some scenarios where you are never going to win. I've had people come up to me and say, Tim, it's not that I don't believe in the project or the work. I just don't like you. There's something about you, and I can't even put my finger on it.
Yeah.
Okay, you and I are going to figure out how this is going to work, or we're not going to work together. That's the end. And you're right. It's a hard fact. And this is where we really learn about what human behavior means.
And if we go into those situations, understanding these are not bad people. There's nothing nefarious about these people. It's just that they don't belong on this project at this time. And so there are other good things that they can be doing rather than opposing your project.
See, this is where knowledge of human behavior really helps us. This is where you make a difference between a project manager who allows the project to move forward and a project manager who excels in helping people.
So I would ask your students, rather than, well, now that I know how much is enough, because it's the stakeholders that are important to getting the job done, I would turn that around back to the students and say, okay, now that we've identified them, how do we assess them? How do we understand their benefit to the project?
And what are the characters you look for when you're assessing stakeholders?
So years ago, I found this quadrant, and I don't know if it was modeled after the Gartner quadrants, the famous quadrants, but this is one that I found in a textbook or in a book somewhere, and I really liked it, and I've used it for years, and it's sort of a interest versus power grid. And so if you think of low interest, low power, low interest, high power, and power meaning influence. So it's low, high. You can have people who have high influence and high influence and high interest, and you can also have people who have high influence and low interest. So if you look at that grid, then you can kind of place your stakeholders within that grid. And once you understand where they fit, then you know how to take care of them during the project process. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a really good way of figuring out what type of engagement. Now, there's another way I like to look at them, which is what you were talking about earlier, negative and positive stakeholders. And we have stakeholders who are neither, right? We have unaware stakeholders who don't know whether they're negative or positive, and we don't know, so we have to figure that out. And we have stakeholders who don't care. They're ambiguous. They're basically, I don't know. It's just another piece of work, I guess. It's like, do we really need them to be supportive? And these are the things that we have to look critically at. And it's not necessarily our opinions. We're always focusing on gathering this type of data and saying, what is it for the sake of a good project, right?
So let's use an example of what you just talked about, and then kind of my assessment tool, or the assessment tool that I discovered. I'm sure project managers who are listening to us have seen this assessment tool and they're yawning right now, but nonetheless, it's probably worth an example. So let's say I have someone who I've identified as having low interest and also low influence or low power. So that might be an organization that they may have some incidental contributions to make, but they're not really interested so much in how the project, in the outcome of the project. They don't really, they're there, they're important, but they're not major contributors. So how I would engage them, again, I wouldn't spend a lot of time managing them, but I might engage them by offering them some tasks that fit their very specific area of interest. And from that, be able to at least gather their requirements, even though I don't spend a lot of time with them. Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, they don't care. They're not curious, and they have low power, but at the same time, you're going to give them enough information that they can get their work done without disrupting your project. And that's it. That's basically what we're looking at.
Well, and I remember a very specific project where we were looking at the admin functions of the system we're doing. And when I say admin, I mean the front desk reception person. So their job was about to go from a manual aspect of greeting people into some sort of automated fashion. And people would think, well, that's just the receptionist. We don't have to talk to the receptionist. We'll just put something in to make them do it. Well, you know that wouldn't work. And so from my perspective, I said, no, we're going to sit down with a receptionist from a large office, a medium-sized office, and a very small office. And we're going to get their requirements. Yes, they are not high power users or influencers, and they don't have a lot of requirements, maybe 5 screens. But it's still important that we get it right. And once we got it right, we didn't see them until we started testing their functionality later on. And it worked according to how they had talked to us. So just something like that is important from the perspective of who is our stakeholder, how do we assess them, and then how do we go about determining their appropriate engagement?
Right, exactly. It sounds fancy and complicated, but actually, once you've done it 3 or 4 times, it's just natural how you do it. You start off with a simple contact list of the primary people who are, or groups who are engaging, and you build on that knowledge, and then you say, okay, how are they going to need to be part of this project in order for this project to be successful? It's as simple as that.
Well, and the other part of that is the more projects you have under your belt, the more your antenna are always listening. I mean, I've been in situations where you're doing a requirements gathering and someone will say, oh, Bill over there passes his documents to us. And
right.
Go, Bill, who's Bill? And why haven't you mentioned Bill before? Oh, it's just a bit player in this. No. Who's Bill? What's he do? Where does that fit? Right. And so your antenna are always up. My analysts said when Bill was dismissed, it's like, oh, he's dismissed. He's not important. But from my perspective, no, we have to hear from Bill.
Right, exactly. And you know, we could actually look at this very, very deeply, but this is the problem. Even in the way we gather data, we have to realize, you know, we're actually in the identification and assessment of stakeholders, the tools we use to capture that data is going to either help us or hinder us. Like one of the ways to actually identify stakeholders is a survey, a general survey, right? It's easy, quick, goes out to a lot of people. Hey, this is what we're doing. This is what we look at. What do you think? Does this impact you? Does it not, right? Number one, it's nice because it gathers pre-organized data in a certain manner, and you can apply all sorts of mathematical analysis to it. But the problem is, it's going to miss these little things. And this is why whenever you do surveys, you also have to do those interviews. You have to talk to human beings because they're going to say, oh, did you talk to Bill?
Yeah. Well, and the other side of that is the nice thing about surveys is you also learn to see people who want to be engaged, but who really have no part in the project. And so you can weed them out. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been on projects where somebody raised their hand and say, oh, I want to be part of that requirements gathering. Well, what part of your job fits this? Nothing, but I just want to be part of that.
I really enjoy the human component of projects and project management, just for almost for entertainment's sake, because it doesn't matter what part of my career you're speaking to humans, and they've acted the same way on my first project, and they'll probably act the same way on my last project too.
I mentioned that book before about everything I learned in kindergarten, or I probably don't have the title exactly right, but I'm thinking of writing a book called Everything I Learned from 40 Years of Watching people in Airports.
Yes, it's the same way. If you are curious about people and why people do the things they do, number one, it's going to make you a great project manager. Number two, it'll make you a wonderful student of human behavior.
Absolutely. So once you identify and assess and get the stakeholders on board, how do you engage with them? How do you keep them interested or feel?
It depends. It depends. What it like interest. Okay. Interest. That's a nice term. I like to use curiosity.
Yeah.
It's a form of interest. And for our conversation, let's call it curiosity. So what do you do to people who are curious? You basically give them the information they need. That's basically it. Communication is our primary form of engagement. And number one, it satiates that curiosity. But number two, it actually can provide them the information to perform their role. Like, are they going to be doing user acceptance testing? Are they going to be participating in evaluation of the requirements register and all those type of things?
Well, on the other side of that same coin is the fact that once you appeal to their interests, to their self-interests, in terms of what do I get out of this project or what do I get out of the resulting system, if you appeal to that, you immediately satisfy their curiosity or make them even more curious so that you really get hold of them on that project. You said communication. To me, that's the only way. And I prefer face-to-face. I know we're in a world of remote and all that sort of thing, and that's great. But there's nothing better than saying, come on, let's go down to the cafeteria, grab a cup of coffee, and let's talk through this. And then ask questions of interest, maybe even spend a few minutes on the football game for the weekend or the whatever, but just become a real person, not just an automaton project manager.
Yeah, exactly. Disembodied voices. We have enough disembodied voices in our lives today. We call up for service on one of our functions that we need, whether it's our telephone or our network or television, and we have that disembodied voice, and it's not engaging us.
It's not. Yeah, there's nothing like that face to face, and we can try to simulate that as much as possible with remote. I know that the last client I worked with, they used Teams, and they used I forget which functionality, but you could actually get on in Teams and you could call the person on the phone. So it'd be like me popping into your office, but I would call them on the Teams phone. They would answer and both video cameras would come on, and then you could converse. You could see what was in their background. You could talk about last night's football game at the high school. You could talk about a number of things, but the important thing is that you had that face-to-face interaction.
Let's start looking at a couple other components. This could be a long-winded discussion, but I think we can wrap this up fairly quickly. What type of soft skills do you think are important when you're working with stakeholders? What are the things we talked about generally, but from a humanistic skills toolkit, what are the skills you like to look at?
As I mentioned earlier in the podcast, is I had just been reading an article on what management in 2023, 2024 is looking for in their project managers and in employees in general. The first thing they're looking for is leadership skills. Interestingly enough, most people aren't born with those. And the second one, and I think these were in order of hierarchy, the second one is communication skills. So not only that you could get your idea across, but you could listen effectively and, speak concisely, but also with authority. And so those became two of the top. I know they also talked about being adaptable and flexible, having resilience. One of the ones that you and I have talked about a fair amount is having some emotional intelligence. So those are the soft skills that to me come to mind that are the highest on that list.
Yeah, and we can actually get into more concrete leadership skills like conflict management, negotiation, and debate, and all these things that actually are part of what helps us manage and maintain our relationships. It's that layer, that veneer of civility that we have as being part of groups. And leadership looks at that emotional intelligence from two sides, right? How do individuals function, like myself, emotionally? And number two, how do relationships work?
Yeah, the
And
self.
yeah, exactly. It's the self and the group assessment on human behavior. And once you figure that out about yourself, you can basically figure out about others.
Well, and the other thing I think from speaking from an IT perspective, whether as a project manager or as a team member, also are very important are collaboration and teamwork skills.
Oh yeah.
You don't just pick those up from reading a book.
Yeah.
Um, and
And go ahead.
and I was also thinking that we solve problems. So problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, innovation, all of those are also soft skills that leadership is looking for right now of the employees of the next couple of years.
Yeah, and again, let's not discount the hard components too. Working with people, you need a shared calendar and a shared schedule. There
Yeah.
has to be that in place where people can actually be assigned work and they can understand how their work fits with the big picture. You have to have some type of communication that works both synchronously and asynchronously. And you have to have some access to shared storage that is a central repository that everybody can rely on. You have to have these things.
Well, and I'll go back even further from my experience. My degree is in computer science. I have a degree in actual the hard sciences. So I came up through the ranks from programmer to analyst to designer through the ranks to project management. And it certainly helped working with my own teams if they understood that I understood them, not just my clients and what their needs were, but my programmers, my developers, my analysts in terms of what they were dealing with on the project as well. So when you said some of those hard skills, yeah, programming, learning 7 or 8 programming languages, learning how to do analysis and design, good analysis and design, certainly took me a long way in my career.
And boy, business, PMI was so astute when they said that project managers are going to have to learn more about business. Just like you said with engineers, being able to understand their mindset and the way they look at things. I cannot stress how important it is to the best of your ability. Understand how finance works,
Yeah.
understand how purchasing and contracting works, and learn what executives do and how executives are part of the process of the cadence of a organization and a corporation. All of these things, and again, it's that context that helps us a lot with our stakeholders.
Well, and I'll give you a very, very recent example in terms of communication and writing skills. I've worked on those for years. Well, lo and behold, today I got an email from one of the rental car companies basically dunning me for some damage that was done to the rental car that I had on vacation a month ago. So I responded to them with logic. I went back to my notes. I had names, I had dates, I had places. I presented the information, took all of the emotion out of it, just wrote it from the perspective of them reading it, not from me trying to get my emotions on the table. Within an hour, they came back and said, we apologize. We're wiping away this. You are correct. There is no damage from your perspective. We're wiping away these charges. Thank you for renting with us. But again, the reaction, the necessary reaction is, I'm not paying that. And you want to just give them your whole barrel full of gunshot, right? But if you just look at it from a calm, logical perspective, in this perspective, my writing skills came in extremely handy, saved me several $100s.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So do you think we've talked about stakeholders enough? Do you think we covered the domain appropriately?
I think we never can talk about stakeholders enough. This is an exciting topic, but I think we have definitely covered it appropriately from the information that's presented in PMBOK 7, but also from our experience. It's one of the most important of the 8 domains to cover. So from my perspective, yes.
I think what we've talked about today, the various aspects of identification, assessment, and engagement, I think we've talked about it from an introductory standpoint.
Yeah.
And I would advise the young or fresh project managers to follow their curiosity and their interest as they explore not just stakeholders themselves, but the whole area of how you treat humans, the human behavior component. Because although we all address this in later parts of our career, it's something everyone can take advantage at any time.
Well, and look at those soft skills and see exactly where you may be deficient and brush up on those. Practice, get your mentor helping you. Be aware of that. Don't work on 12 at a time. Work on 1 or 2 most important ones and just become a better project manager as a result.
Very good. So thank you. I'm excited, and I really appreciate pursuing this domain, and I'm really interested in how we're going to approach and discuss the other 7. I look forward to covering these areas.
Anything that involves the way we're tackling these from the human perspective is very engaging, and I'm hoping we're getting that across to our audience.
Yes.
All right. Until next time.
Thanks again, Merv. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody for checking in on us on a regular basis.